Thanks so much, Karen, and everybody for being here with us today. Um, so greetings, good morning, good afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the roundtable entitled Kashmir and India-Pakistan War Games 2025. My name is Dolores Chu, and I'm a professor of history and humanities at Marinopolis College in Montreal. And I'm also an affiliate associate professor at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute of Concordia University, also in Montreal. I'm a part of several diaspora action and groups and forums in Montreal. One is CERAS, Centre sur l'Asie du Sud, and the other is SARAK, the acronym for the South Asian Diaspora Action Collective, among many other groups. Many of us here in the room are wearing many hats. At this point, I would like to begin by acknowledging that I have joined this webinar from the unceded indigenous lands of the Gani and Kahaka. The Gani and Kahaka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. More specifically, joining from Georgiaga, the city colonially known as Montreal. The event is organized by several groups and co-sponsored by even more. So the organizing groups are SARAK, the acronym for the South Asian Diaspora Action Collective, the Kashmir Scholars Consultancy Advocacy Network, or KSCAN, and Just Peace Advocates, or JPA. And I would also like to say that JPA and Karen Rodman particularly have been key to organizing this event and, getting the technology together, running it, etc. So big shout out to Karen and JPA among the other groups. There are many groups that have co-sponsored the event: Academics for Palestine Concordia, Alliance Against Islamophobia in Australia, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, Canadian Forum for Human Rights and Democracy in India, Canadian Voices for Palestinian Rights, the Centre sur l'Asie du Sud, or CERAS, Critical Diasporic South Asian Feminisms Collective, Hindus for Human Rights, India Labour Solidarity UK, International Solidarity for Academic Freedom in India, INSAF, Justice for All Canada, Palestinian and Jewish Unity, South Asia Solidarity Group UK, Stand with Kashmir, and World Beyond War. They've been all listed in alphabetical order. We thank all our co-sponsors for their ongoing and wholehearted support for this event. So now some introductory remarks. Thank you all for joining us for this roundtable on Kashmir and the recent military confrontations between India and Pakistan. As most of you are already aware, this most recent escalation of military action between India and Pakistan began on April 22nd, when an armed group attacked tourists in the Baisaran Valley near Pahalgam, killing 26 men, one of whom was Nepali, 24 who were Indians, and one Kashmiri Muslim, Sayyid Adil Hussain Shah, who was shot and killed while trying to protect the tourists and stop the gunmen. After this tragic event, a militant group calling themselves the Resistance Front initially claimed responsibility for the attack, claiming it was done in order to oppose what they see as forced demographic change in Kashmir through the granting of Kashmir domicile status and increasingly settling non-Kashmiris in Kashmir. However, days later, the Resistance Front denied responsibility for the attack, claiming their digital platforms were victims of, quote unquote, a coordinated cyber intrusion or hacking as, quote, part of an orchestrated campaign to malign the Kashmiri resistance, close quote. Almost immediately, speculation ran rampant trying to identify who was really behind the attacks and what their real motivation was. Indian news media quickly circulated claims that the Resistance Front was in fact Lashkar-e-Taiba under another name, that Lashkar-e-Taiba is a Pakistan-based and Pakistani armed and trained terrorist group, and therefore that this attack was a covert operation by the Pakistani military to attack India and innocent Indian citizens. Some even speculated that this was a Pakistani covert operation performed in return for Indian covert operations behind the March 11 attack on the Jafar Express train in Balochistan, Pakistan. Pakistani news media circulated claims that this attack was actually a false flag. This attack in Pahalgam was actually a false flag operation planned and organized by Indian security agencies in order to blame Pakistan and initiate a military conflict in order to garner positive nationalist affection for Prime Minister Modi and his BJP party in India at a time when they are losing support, as evidenced in recent polls in the run-up to state assembly elections in India, and also at a time when the coming years will be pivotal in shaping the nation's political and governance framework. Needless to say, tensions between India and Pakistan escalated, with India downgrading diplomatic ties with Pakistan and unilaterally suspending the 1960 Indus Water Treaty that established water sharing of Himalaya-originating rivers between India and Pakistan. Escalation continued, with troops exchanging fire across the line of control, and things escalated still further with India launching missile attacks on Pakistan-administered Kashmir and Punjab on 7th May, followed by cross-border air assaults by both India and Pakistan on each other's territories until a truce was declared on May the 10th. However, conspicuously absent in most of the reporting on these recent events are Kashmiris themselves. Kashmiris who have, by and large, been the ones injured and killed in these cross-border air assaults. Few seem to be reporting on how the Pahalgam attacks have been almost unanimously condemned by Kashmiris, how Kashmiris have been attacked and abused by vigilantes across India, how approximately 2,000 to 3,000 Kashmiris have been detained by Indian security for quote-unquote questioning regarding the April 22nd attacks. The detainees, including many members of the press and human rights workers, are included, and almost no one is mourning the loss of Kashmiri civilian lives amidst these military actions. Also lacking is discussion of the historical background preceding these recent events and how this history has shaped and reshaped the situation in Kashmir. And most importantly, unamplified are the thoughts and feelings of Kashmiris leading up to and throughout these events, which is why we are here today, to recenter Kashmiris in discussions of these recent events. Our esteemed speakers today will unpack issues of international law and human rights, the use of hate rhetoric to drum up support for war. They will speak about Zionist tactics borrowed by Hindutva. They will speak about the lack of press freedom. They will speak about the erasure and silencing of Kashmiri voices. We aim to focus our discussion on the impact of the recent attacks on the economy, demography, climate, life, dignity, and the very existence of ordinary Kashmiris in the context of the changed nature of Kashmir since 2019, the year Article 370 in the Indian Constitution was revoked. For those not familiar with this, Article 370 had granted special status to Indian-administered Kashmir, which meant, among other things, restricting property ownership and residency rights in the state for non-Kashmiris. Furthermore, we will confront the failure of the international community to contribute meaningfully to resolving the long-standing dispute over Kashmir, which has cost tens of thousands of lives for over 7 decades and has kept the region of Kashmir always on the brink of war. There is an urgency to find a just and permanent resolution of the Kashmir issue as per the wishes of the people of the region of Kashmir. Finally, we will address how demilitarization and disarmament under neutral global supervision is urgently needed to avert war and destruction not only for the broader safety of the world, but for Kashmiris themselves, whose homeland and lives are the very grounds upon which these India-Pakistan war games are fought. So, let me introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Athar Zia is a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and a columnist. She is an associate professor of anthropology and gender studies at the University of Northern Colorado. She is the author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation, and Women's Activism in Kashmir. She is the founder-editor of Kashmir Lit and is the co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, which is an interdisciplinary network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. She is also a co-editor of Cultural Anthropology. Robert Fantina is an author and journalist working for peace and social justice. He writes extensively about US foreign policy and the Middle East with a focus on Palestine. He is the author of several books, including Settler Colonialism in Palestine and Kashmir, and Propaganda, Lies, and False Flags, How the US Justifies Its Wars. Dr. Omer Aijazi is an assistant professor of critical disaster studies at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. He is the author of Atmospheric Violence, Disaster and Repair in Kashmir, which explores how communities along the militarized line of control in Kashmir make life possible amidst the ongoing devastation of environmental disaster and political violence. And our final speaker is Imran Mir, who is a lawyer, entrepreneur, and author. His Kashmir-related work involves research, writing, and advocacy to improve understanding of historic and contemporary realities and to promote accountability for rights violations. He has done human rights-related work on Kashmir since the late 1990s, independently and through various organizations, including the Kashmir Law and Justice Project. He holds a JD from Harvard Law School. So how will the webinar run? In the first part, our four speakers will take turns providing initial presentations. Then, in the next part of the webinar, our four speakers will ask each other follow-up questions. And in the third and final part, we will open it up for questions from the audience. And for the audience, if you wish to submit questions, you need to do it through the Q&A function of Zoom throughout the roundtable. So thank you very much. And we'll now begin with the first of the speakers' comments. So I will call on Dr. Athar Zia, who will talk about the background of what brought us to the current moment. Dr. Zia, please.
I couldn't find the unmute. Thank you so much, everyone, for organizing this much-needed event. And I have been given the task to introduce and give context, so I have some written remarks in the interest of time, which I'm going to read. So to understand the Pahalgam attack in April 2025, when armed assailants targeted Indian tourists, it is crucial to situate how Kashmir as a territory and Kashmiris as a polity exist at this juncture, especially within a broader political, military, and ideological escalation from India in the last 3 decades, and especially post-2019, or the last 7 decades if we want a deeper historical perspective. Given the limitations of time, I will briefly contextualize this moment of confrontation that engages the ire of 2 countries and the political fate of Kashmiris as a people at the mercy of nation-state politics. I'm sorry, our cat has decided to join the event and she is just all over the place. A word that increasingly resounds in the Kashmir Valley today is dispossession. The Indian state's strategic institutionalization of land expropriation has become central to displacing native Kashmiris. The government of India has always used its infrastructure projects in the war-torn, ecologically fragile Himalayan territory as part of a broader military occupation. We are witnessing an intensified phase of state-backed land grabs and property dispossession, and Kashmiris invariably perceive India as strengthening its colonial control, facilitating troop movement, demographic shifts, and the final push for settler expansion. Operational as a brutal military occupation, India's settler colonial project has come of age and become unapologetically, explicitly, and spectacular as a settler colonial process. It has been sustained since 1947 in iterative phases focused on conquering, controlling, assimilating, and ultimately erasing Kashmiri indigeneity. Finally, the goal that India's first Prime Minister Nehru spelled out in the 1960s and even 1940s itself, on August 5th, 2019, the current dispensation revoked Kashmir's autonomy in a military-backed move, stripping the region of its territorial sovereignty without the consent of Kashmiris. Since then, India has increased land acquisitions exponentially by changing laws to alter land ownership, enabling widespread evictions, demolitions, and confiscating properties. These legal changes are focused on promoting settlements and demographic change to systematically erase the indigenous population while criminalizing their movement for sovereignty and self-determination. The Indian government operates unimpeded under the guise of integrating the territory, development, and fighting what Kashmiri resistance that is cast as outright terrorism or proxy war. No doubt, anti-Muslim and Islamophobic global and regional politics help. In violation of UN resolutions and international law, India has changed Kashmir's landscape through dense militarization, resource extraction, and the economic exploitation that entrenches colonial benefits at the cost of local communities. As theorized by Patrick Wolf, the structure of invasion in settler colonialism, and in this case of Kashmir by India that began in 1947, has grown over time under varying guises, as I already mentioned. I argue that the settler colonial framework possesses an iterative temporal dynamic, a mechanism that involves and adapts over time in which native peoples are engaged in the process that enable establishing, changing, and in time diluting, eliminating, and replacing the indigenous population to secure settler control. By examining how European settler colonialism took root and evolved in contexts like Palestine, Turtle Island, and other places across the globe, we can trace a distinct structural continuity and progression of Indian settler colonialism in Kashmir. At the same time, we must account for regions' historical, political, and geographical specificities. India's condition of quote-unquote post-coloniality and quote-unquote democracy plays a crucial role here, shaping the way it enacts settler colonialism in Kashmir. Rather than marking a rupture from colonialism, the post-colonial condition here operates as a mode of neo-colonial governance, enabling the projection of liberal democratic legitimacy alongside practices of occupation and settler expansion, which is operational in Kashmir at the moment. So post-coloniality and democracy, often presented as India's defining characteristics, become tools used against Kashmiris whose political aspirations closely mirror the subcontinent's struggle for self-rule against British colonization. It's essential to problematize these frameworks to understand how they enable and justify the military occupation and settler colonialism in Kashmir. Indian settler colonialism has developed in distinct phases over different time periods, with each stage building upon and reinforcing the one before, resulting in a cumulative native dispossession. This layered process includes the initial annexation and territorial control, followed by clientelist politics designed to undermine local agencies and also the UN resolutions. Assimilation policies and the engineering of complicity further erode Kashmiri identity, while weaponized infrastructure and the manipulation of autonomy and democratic politics deepen control and weaken resistance. Over time, Indian government, both liberal and right-wing, have consolidated their grip through juridical and legal frameworks and enforced direct military domination through laws like Armed Forces Special Powers Act and a host of others. Each of these strategies strengthen the other, creating an evolving system of military occupation, human rights violations, criminalizing resistance, demographic change is made operational, and land dispossession. India has enforced cultural erasure by tightly controlling the narratives, criminalizing resistance, institutionalizing censorship, dominating media, incarcerating political and human rights activists. Kashmir is the world's most densely militarized region, occupied by more than 700,000 Indian troops. And there are also questions about how this very recent attack in Pahalgam was even made or allowed or came into being. The Indian Army has targeted both armed resistance and the civilian population through killing, torture, mass incarcerations, and the use of rape as a weapon of war. The world's first recorded mass blindings and relentless curfews, crackdowns, and military checkpoints, all of which have deepened Kashmir's settler colonial nightmare. Widespread human rights violations, which include over 100,000 people, have been killed, both combatants and non-combatants, and the enforced disappearances of more than 10,000 people since the armed resistance began in 1989, and which people in this moment can even protest for. As mentioned earlier, in 2019, India abrogated Kashmir's autonomy through a brutal escalation of military aggression, placing the region under siege and communication lockdown for over 7 to 8 months. India banned international media, plunging the region into a communication black hole. Genocide Watch at that moment put an alert on the region, and the Lancet sounded alarm on growing humanitarian crisis. Over the last 5 years, Indian authorities have unilaterally made new laws entrenching dispossession, imprisonments, criminalization of dissent, or resistance to its rule. Before 2019, India had systematically chipped away at Kashmir's autonomy, but it still needed local approval to change laws. Indigenous people were permanent residents of the region, a status that preceded the creation of the nation states of India and Pakistan. They had exclusive rights to land, voting, and standing for public office. Non-permanent residents, even if Indian citizens, were limited in rights, but they still occupied high administrative positions, owned businesses, and leased properties and land. Since 2019, they are eligible to become permanent residents. Indian authorities have registered about 2.5 million new voters, signaling a huge demographic shift that Kashmiris dread. Indian military, which already occupies a sizable portion of the territory, are empowered further to seize areas or property deemed strategic without anyone's consent. The participation of native Kashmiris in political and economic decision-making is almost negligible. Since 2019, India has unapologetically formalized its direct control over the region after stripping after stripping Kashmir of statehood. It was demoted to 2 union territories governed by Indian appointees. Currently, Kashmir Valley is ruled by an appointee from the Bharatiya Janata Party, the right-wing Hindu supremacist outfit. With extended powers, this appointee holds sole control of land, public order, and the police. The BJP has long framed Kashmir as a Hindu land, casting aspersions on Kashmiri Muslim indigeneity and depicting them as invaders and outsiders. Kashmiris' demands for self-determination and liberation are used to doubly stigmatize them as anti-national as well as terrorists. A local administration was elected in 2024, but its legislative powers are curtailed. Before 26, they could legislate on most matters except for defense, foreign affairs, finance, and communication, which were under Indian control already. Kashmir had a separate flag and constitution, and most Indian laws did not automatically apply, but that is now relegated to the past. For the last 5 years, the Indian normalcy paradigm has become another mode of occupation. The Indian government has launched an aggressive normalcy narrative, which includes weaponizing tourism, especially as a soft colonial industry, creating a servile, dependent economic apparatus. In the absence of political sovereignty and industrial self-determination, tourism has become a pacified, externally driven substitute, one that aims to discipline the population into service roles under the guise of cosmetic peace and development. The Pahalgam attack complicates the Indian narrative of normalization. While the promotion of tourism and pilgrimage is presented as evidence of return to stability, such incidents reveal the persistence of unresolved political tensions and structural violence of settler colonialism. However, we must also refrain from interpreting these acts as reflective of a collective Kashmiri will to conflate individual and militant action with the broader aspirations of the population. The desire for justice and freedom amongst Kashmiris does not necessitate or should not be reduced to a will to inflict harm on people. in the least the tourists, an act which most Kashmiris protested in an unprecedented manner. It is also telling how these solidarity protests and visuals, when this attack happened, were allowed by the government, while Kashmiris have not been able to protest in the last 5 years at all, especially the kind of human rights activities that were involved, that were very actively being pursued by Kashmiris in the last 33 years. Kashmir's resolution does not seek company of such carnage. The attack in parliament highlights the contradictions in Indian policy of militarized peace and suppressing political dissent, which furthers its ethno-nationalistic goals, but which does not serve the aspirations and stakes that Kashmiris have in this dispute. Then I do have another question, but I don't know if I have to talk about that now or maybe later, but these are
Yeah,
my
so
introductory
maybe
remarks.
we can keep it for the next round, Athar, because we're out of time. So if that's okay with you. So thank you so much, Athar, for this really, I mean, we gave you very limited time and you've done an amazing job, setting things out in terms of the timeline, but also the multiple layers of colonization and how it has worked and how it's working. So thank you very much for that very rich introductory set of comments. There is a follow-up question that I would like to put to you. I mean, you started talking about it, but maybe a little more now. How do you see what is often referred to as the Kashmir question being reshaped in light of the latest confrontation between India and Pakistan?
So I think that was the next question. I actually prepared remarks because I know we are on strict timeline. So
Yeah. So absolutely. Yeah, please go for it.
that's what I was asking about. Just
Oh,
a
sorry, my bad. Yeah, okay.
No, it's totally fine. I'm just gonna bring my document back. So I think in this moment, I just kind of like when I was thinking about this question, I thought about that there is this growing danger of bypassing Kashmiris in this whole dispute. So as we kind of think about Kashmir, it's roughly half the size of California, and it's carved up between these three nuclear powers, India, Pakistan, and China, each controlling different parts. And now the world has woken up to this brinkmanship that has always been part and parcel of the relationship between India and Pakistan, as well as China, despite numerous peace treaties and ceasefire policies. So Kashmir straddles the hot center of the relationship between these countries. But Kashmiris themselves, they've been facing this war in all forms, conventional, non-conventional, whatever you might want to call it, since 1947, and they have shown their political will in different forms, armed and non-armed as well. So we must understand Kashmir as one of the symptoms of neo-colonial crisis that the world is facing today, born of nation-state framework imposed by colonial exit strategies, the classic colonial exit strategies, one that flattened the region's deeply rooted and interlaced cultural, spiritual, and political identities into the binary of nationalism. The Pahalgam attack signals the continued securitization of Kashmir and the deep entrenchment of state narratives that sees the region primarily through the lens of control and threat management. Politically, it reflects how Kashmiris remain suspended in this state of exception, where civilian life is overshadowed by militarized governance, and every violent event is used to justify further suppression rather than to interrogate the unresolved political status of the region. There is a real danger that the renewed attention to Kashmir, prompted by the latest India-Pakistan confrontation, will be reshaped through the familiar contours of the global security paradigm, where Kashmir becomes a flashpoint of nuclear anxiety rather than a site of indigenous struggle. In this framing, Kashmir is not seen through the lens of justice, self-determination, or decolonization or demilitarization, but rather a risk that is to be managed by global powers. Such a reframing ultimately serves the interests of these actors, the nation-state actors, while further marginalizing Kashmiri themselves. As the international gaze intensifies, maybe in the future, but we don't know where that will go, repression on the ground is already deepening and taking different forms. When this happened, more than 2,000 Kashmiris were already detained, and it's also right now in actively kind of imposing on people's lives, and many people have already been killed. It's the Kashmiris who do the dying. So, as the international gaze intensifies, repression on ground is deepening precisely to prevent Kashmiri dissent from entering or disrupting this securitized narrative. And they're already silenced by a rigorous set of laws that are around them, like the bars in a birdcage. The irony is that global visibility may lead not to solidarity with Kashmiris, but to their erasure, where they're spoken about but never heard. This is the ongoing psychic violence of the border that I kind of like call as a psychic border. That's what Kashmir ends up being treated as, not only marking territorial limits, but also the edges of permissible thought, memory, and speech. The imperative in Kashmir is not merely one of political resolution, but of decolonization and demilitarization, and rigorous dismantling of settler infrastructures and imperial modes of governance. Only through such disarmament, both material and epistemic, can Kashmiris begin to collectively imagine futures that are not foreclosed by violence of capitalist nation states, nor by ecocidal modernity, which is what the decolonial indigenous scholars from Palestine to Turtle Island and all other wounded places in the world teach us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Athar, for that really nuanced response. Again, recentering Kashmir and the Kashmiri people, which is our aim and objective today. Very much so. Sorry, I will now invite Robert Fantina, who will speak about the tactics employed by the Indian state with the use of hate rhetoric to drum up support for violence and war, for settler colonial policies, and for the affinity of Hindutva and Zionism. Robert, please.
Thank you, and good day. I'm honored to be among this distinguished panel. I'd like to start with a partial definition of settler colonialism from the Oxford Dictionary. Quote, settler colonialism is an ongoing system of power that perpetuates the genocide and repression of indigenous peoples and cultures. Essentially hegemonic in scope, settler colonialism normalizes the continuous settler occupation, exploiting lands and resources to which indigenous people have genealogical relationships. Settler colonialism includes interlocking forms of oppression, including racism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. Close quote. That the Indian project in Kashmir is a settler colonial one can't be denied. The killing of Kashmiris in their own nation, the destruction of their means of livelihood, the replacing of government officials in Kashmir with Indians, these and other violations of international law and the human rights of the Kashmiri people demonstrate clearly the brutal settler colonial project of India. One might wonder how the Indian government has caused the people of India to accept this blatant brutality against an innocent and basically defenseless population. The teachings of Hindutva, which Prime Minister Narendra Modi and many other officials and citizens of India follow, is clear. Its goal is to make India a Hindu state. Sudha Ramachandran, writing in Counter-Terrorist Trends and Analysis, described this ideology. She said this, quote, Hindutva is a modern political ideology that views India as a Hindu nation and defines Indian culture in terms of Hindu cultural values. Its goal is to make India a Hindu state, close quote. We also have the words of Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, who in 1923 said that Hindus are the only true Indians as their fatherland and holy land are in India. Muslims and Christians, he said, could not be considered Indian as their holy lands were not in India. His ideological successor, Madhav Sadashiv Golwalkar, one of the founders of RSS, said that, quote, foreign races, that is, Muslims and Christians, in India must either adopt the Hindu culture and language, must learn to respect and hold in reverence Hindu religion, must lose their separate existence to merge in the Hindu race, or stay in the country wholly subordinated to the Hindu nation, claiming nothing, deserving no privileges, far less any preferential treatment, not even citizens' rights, close quote. In January of 1991, Sumanta Banerjee, writing in Economic and Political Weekly, said that Christians and Muslims must prove their loyalty to India and the Hindu religion by joining with Hindus and demolishing the Babri Masjid and set up a Hindu temple. This mosque, over 450 years old, was in fact destroyed in the following year, so a Hindu temple could be built on the site. One article I read mentioned that activists destroyed it, not terrorists, not criminals, but activists. Banerjee referred to a statement by the right-wing Indian nationalist organization, VHP's leader at the time, Asak Singhal Al, who said this, quote, "If the Hindu sentiments sweep the whole country, the Muslims would realize that neither the police nor the government nor political parties would be able to save them from the wrath," close quote. These quotations are foundational to Hindutva, and such sentiments are clearly in focus today. In February of this year, the India Hate Lab, based in Washington, recorded that instances of hate speech in India increased by 74% in 2024. 98.5% of those instances targeted Muslims. Among the people most frequently spewing such speech, according to the report, were Modi and Home Minister Amit Shah. Referring back to the definition of settler colonialism that I mentioned earlier, let's consider the power differential between India and Kashmir. Kashmir, as has been mentioned, is the most heavily militarily occupied country on earth, with estimates ranging from 1 soldier for every 30 Kashmiris to 1 soldier for every 17 Kashmiris. Exact numbers are difficult to determine, but even with the estimate of 1 to 30, Kashmiris are forced to live in constant fear. If I were discussing settler colonialism, occupation, military and illegal oppression of an occupied nation, and a variety of other injustices, without naming India and Kashmir, one might easily think I was discussing Israel and Palestine. Hindutva and Zionism, that belief by Jews of Jews being God's chosen people who are destined to occupy all of Palestine, are cut from the same ugly mold. The similarities are remarkable, but not surprising. We will look at just a few. Both India and Israel repress free speech and freedom of the press. After the abrogation of Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, India implemented a complete internet blackout in Kashmir that lasted for nearly 18 months. Israel, for the last 19 months, has targeted journalists, press vehicles, and buildings, especially in the Gaza Strip, forbidding foreign journalists from entering and killing at least 170 journalists as of February of this year. And this, of course, has been an ongoing pattern in Palestine by Israel. The racist regimes of India and Israel both use indefinite detention, which enables them to arrest and detain without charge anyone suspected of what is loosely defined as terrorist activity. These victims are often held for years and sometimes decades without charge and without access to families or lawyers. Children as young as 12 are detained in this way. Victims in Kashmir and Palestine who suffer from police or military violence at the hands of occupying soldiers have no real recourse. India and Israel grant their government-paid terrorists nearly complete impunity for any crimes they commit. India has the so-called Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which grants special power to members of the armed forces. This act includes this sentence, quote, "No prosecution, suit, or other legal proceeding shall be instituted except with the previous sanction of the central government against any person in respect of anything done or purported to be done in exercise of the powers conferred by this act," close quote. This basically grants Indian soldiers the right to commit any act without consequence. Among the abusers these soldiers and their Israeli counterparts commit is torture. This includes, for both men and women, beatings while hanging from the ceiling, scalding with water, being chained hand and foot, sleep and food deprivation, extended periods of nakedness, and many others. Both India and Israel routinely arrest and torture Kashmiri and Palestinian children. Both India and Israel commit what might be called health terrorism on their victims. An article in TRT World from 2021 said this, quote, "Gaza was already suffering from a shortage of medical equipment after more than a decade of deadly Israeli siege, leaving hospitals without vital equipment to cope with the pandemic." In Kashmir, Human Rights Watch reported that less than 2 weeks after the August 5th, 2019 abrogation of Article 370, a group of doctors raised the alarm. Quote, "In an August 16th letter in the medical journal BMJ, 19 doctors from across India asked the government to ease restrictions on communication and travel, saying there were a blatant denial of the right to health care and the right to life because they made it difficult for patients and staff to reach hospitals without hindrance." What some nations call terrorism is in truth resistance. It is unreasonable to believe that a nation whose citizens are oppressed, tortured, arrested, and detained without charge, forced to live without hope, will simply tolerate these conditions. As they resist, whether in Palestine or Kashmir, Those of us who can't speak must speak. We must not rest until the people of Kashmir and of Palestine are free. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robert. I have, for bringing to our knowledge the sort of very evident similarities, which not all of us are aware of. And, historically, when I've spoken to people who don't know much about Kashmir, but know about Palestine, I say, Kashmir is the Palestine of South Asia and vice versa. So thank you so much for that. I have a follow-up question, and that is, why do Western nations ignore the appalling human rights abuses and violations of international law? Because you have itemized, the impunity that is ongoing. Why do Western nations ignore this?
The leaders of Western nations are more interested in power and profit than they are in human rights and international law. This has been made clear to the world since the October resistance and genocide since then in Palestine, and it is clear in Kashmir too. India is a nation growing in economic might, and world leaders want to take advantage of that. Therefore, they will overlook the appalling human rights abuses, the violations of international law, in order to enrich themselves mostly, but also to benefit usually the elite within their countries.
Okay. Thanks so much. And I know we'll have a little more time if to explore this with the conversations between everyone who's speaking and then responding to questions. So now we'll go to our next speaker, Dr. Omer Ijazi, who will shed light on the ground reality, on the real lives of people living on the margins of the border, and about the erasure and silencing of Kashmiri voices. Dr. Ijazi, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Atul and Robert, for giving us, all this necessary context and for forefronting the historical and contemporary settler, colonial, and imperial imaginations that situate everyday life in Kashmir. And also, how these logics of empire structure discourse and our very ideas of moral outrage. So whose lives are mourned in the public sphere, whose lives are venerated, and whose lives are dismissed as, mere casualties of war or as collateral damage, and whose aspirations, desires are centered. So, we saw, the flourishing of Pakistani and Indian nationalisms. We saw the celebration of soldiers who engaged in military action, and we're still seeing the celebration of Indian and Pakistani military strength. But if you've heard very little about, Kashmiri lives that were arguably once again at the center of these escalations. So why is it that Kashmir always becomes, in the center of India-Pakistan warfare, but we never really hear about the impacts of war on their lives? And it's not that, Kashmiris have not been speaking or voiceless, but, as people of South Asia, are we prepared to listen? I think it's important for me to kind of repeat some, grounding facts. First of all, Kashmir is a disputed territory. It is currently under colonial rule and under military occupation. It is not simply, a bilateral concern between Pakistan and India. Kashmiris possess, sophisticated political analysis of their homeland and a very solid vision for their future. India has ambitions of empire, and Pakistan would perhaps likely do the same if given a chance. So given all this, what is, a Kashmir-centered discourse of these escalations? And I want to respond to this question by taking us to the line of control, which once again, became the battlefront between both countries. I think many of you will know the line of control, is a heavily militarized de facto border that divides Kashmir into Indian-held and Pakistan-held areas. The line of control, or the LOC, like all border lines, is an instrument of separation and containment. Its legacy lies in the war between India and Pakistan over Kashmir following partition, and was formalized and further hardened in 1972. India has been fencing the side it controls since the late 1990s, which, kind of recreates an illusion of state spatiality, and that also justifies further compartmentalization and incorporation of Kashmir under its control. And this was exemplified in the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act passed in 2019. Um, so both, Pakistani and Indian militaries are stationed on either sides of the LOC, with villages and civilian infrastructure, directly within the line of fire. On the Indian side of alone, we have over 1 million people who are said to be residing what is considered to be in the vicinity of the line of control, and a much more higher number is estimated for those living under Pakistan's administration. Um, People here are mostly pastoralists. Many work as daily wage laborers who migrate to large cities for seasonal work. Most are engaged in subsistence or agriculture. People in the vicinity of the LSE, for the most part, live under continuous conditions of unpredictable war. Firing can start between militaries at any time. This includes, mortar shelling, bombs, projectiles, and so forth. And despite, an official ceasefire back in 2003, there have been thousands of ceasefire violations over the years. And each time relations between India and Pakistan worsen, there's hostility across the LOC. That's how you gauge the tension in the region, like we just saw also very recently. Um, just a few days ago, when I learned about, the cancellation of schools in Pakistan and India, during the height of these escalations, and, checking in on my family, and loved ones, I have a nephew who studies in Pakistan, and he told me that they were doing, evacuation exercises in their institution. And it seemed like a big deal for Pakistani or Indian young people to be confronted with the possibility of war in such a large way. But my colleagues who live, in the vicinity of the line of control were like, we always have lived in that uncertainty, at the whim of, a trigger-happy soldier. So he was like, maybe for once, maybe you too can understand what we go through, on a regular basis. So I think, we should take that to heart. Um, um, and with these, current escalations, once again, the LSC was activated in ways that, have not been experienced in decades, with overwhelming military buildup on both sides. Again, there was heavy artillery exchange, firing, mortar shelling. The use of missiles and drones was a new addition this time. The shelling and firing was so intense that often penetrated much further into distant towns and cities that are typically spared from the firing. And usually it's only, the villages within much or, more or less in the, quite close proximity of what they call the zero line, that are subjected to this kind of exchange. But this time the range was much further, reaching far into urban, and semi-urban areas. We have first-hand accounts of destruction, injury, death from all across the line of control, from Kotli to Poonch on either sides, all the way up to the Neelam Valley. Live reporting was banned in Indian administered Kashmir, and with very limited access on either side, we don't have, reliable figures of how many people were killed, injured, or the actual scale of the devastation caused. But we do know that the language of precision attacks or surgical strikes is dishonest and impossible, given the scale of militarization and how military infrastructure is so embedded within civilian life. It's just a physical impossibility, to be precise, in these contexts. Um, I know many people have reported that this was the heaviest shelling experience in their lifetime. And each time, a firing erupts, people are forced to go into bunkers or underground shelters. Livestock is killed, infrastructure, homes, hospitals, schools are damaged. And these provisions are all already, very basic and provisional here. And then there's the compounded, feeling of unsafety and this enduring sense of violence. Um, there are bunkers on each side where people can take refuge, but since the shelling was so intense and far-reaching, there weren't enough. There weren't enough protective infrastructure. A lot of people ended up evacuating their villages. But since these are isolated parts, there wasn't enough, public transportation or road infrastructure to actually move people out, or for people to move themselves out of these very contested and heated regions. A lot of people were scrambling on their own. Even if they had the ability to evacuate, where do they evacuate to? And a lot of people stayed back and took a chance. Um, typically, firing and violence across the LOC is kind of normalized in the imagination of Kashmir. Somehow, since the LOC is, a border area, death and devastation there gets bracketed and dismissed as something that is inevitable. And that's exactly what happened this time around too. There was, much uproar and about attacks on major Indian and Pakistani urban centers, and legal instruments and language of sovereignty and self-defense were evoked. But this once again invisibilized millions of Kashmiris living in the vicinity of the line of control, and an understanding of what constitutes a border area was rapidly expanded. So in a way, the LSC also became an important, instrument of erasure because it created this notion of a border area where violence is simply normalized just by virtue of being in the vicinity of a border. And in that sense, invisibilized. And Kashmiris were once again reduced to casualties of war, collateral damage as being insignificant, in the theater of war and as a testing ground for new weapons. And I think it was only very recently when people have been able to return back home, again, cautiously. There are warnings that there's, unexploded ammunition and so forth, adding to the dangers of life there. These are spaces where there is already a significant presence of unexploded landmines that often get washed from the actual fortified border into village spaces. There is the constant, state of fear, uncertainty, and perpetual, warlike conditions. And even if, this broader ceasefire is reached, ceasefire violations across the LOC continue to this day. Back to you, Dolores.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Omer, for bringing out, I mean, in very palpable ways, the impact on people's daily lives and the insecurities when your sources of livelihood are destroyed and so on. Again, things that we don't often hear about in terms of statistics and details, etc. I'm wondering if you could add a little more to what you said in terms of lasting impacts about that recent escalations will likely have on people's lives near the line of control, if you'd like to add a few more points there.
I think, one thing we can say for sure that these escalations will only accelerate and embolden militarization across the region and certainly increase militarization off the line of control. This will likely mean the buildup of, military personnel along both sides, increased border fortification, which means things like more landmines and exploded ammunition, which ends up in civilian areas, more death and injury. Who are the most, often victims of unexploded ammunition? It's children. So basically, a thickening and densification and fortressing of the border, further impacting people's mobility and safety. I think people will have lesser or more, compromised access to pastures and the surrounding forestways, which people depend on for their livelihoods. People are very much reliant on free movement in these mountain spaces to access pastures, forage for food, access firewood, and every element of their lives and survival will likely be compromised. And with increasing, military infrastructure and military personnel, there's going to be increased surveillance of communities along the line of control as well in its vicinity. This means more checkpoints, more obstacles to entering or leaving the region. People's communications are already monitored. For example, their mobile phone calls are always under surveillance. All this will likely increase. Crossings across the LOC for family members and relatives, which is already incredibly difficult to negotiate, will likely become even harder. further breaking connections and relationality between Kashmiri people. And you remember, this is, the line of control is a de facto border put in place as a temporary solution till a plebiscite can be held, where Kashmiris can decide their own futures. So, further, overall imposition of a border logics or border ontologies. And by this, I mean people will be forced to further shape and align their lives in relation to the thickening, densifying, imposed border as opposed to living, for example, in relation to each other or to the land. Kashmiris in this region have been calling for the immediate demilitarization of the LOC and a permanent ceasefire for a long time, and for making the LOC even more porous, so that families can be reunited. And I think whatever small gains that have been made will unfortunately be reversed or momentarily, suspended, but not to lose hope. Border zones are also sites of creativity and improvisation, and Kashmiris are resilient. They will find a way to flourish even in the most difficult circumstances and dehumanizing conditions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Omer, and also for those hopeful notes. And, we've already been talking about comparisons between Palestine and Kashmir and the amazing creativity, as you say, and resilience that we see in both these places, despite horrendous conditions and greatest odds. We now go to our last speaker of this first round. This is Imran Mir, who will speak on the Indus Water Treaty that India has put on abeyance. And Imran will also speak on international law and human rights, as well as on the state of press freedom in Kashmir. Imran.
Thank you, Dolores, and thank you all for joining, taking the time to engage with this. It's critically important and not well understood, so your participation is really valued. I will talk about law, and I think about law primarily as a language in these contexts. So what I mean by that is not so much rules that impartially protect people, but rather a widely understandable language that provides a standard, and that standard does certain work. I think the primary work that it does is it is what we need to believe is real or realizable in order to have peace. So there's two terms people have kind of mentioned, and I'll describe them, that are important legal terms in this context. One is occupation. In law, occupation is the idea of effective control without title. It means that a state controls others' territory. It is often illegal. It typically involves myriad violations. Colonization is something different. It is alien domination, subjugation, and exploitation, outsiders' denial of a people's right to self-determination. All of Jammu and Kashmir, the historic territory of Jammu and Kashmir, which means is in reference to a political entity that existed prior to the British leaving South Asia in 1947, all of that territory is occupied territory. Pakistan administered Kashmir, and we're talking about that region in part, is occupied under law, but not colonized. Indian administered Kashmir is both occupied and colonized. And Robert and Arthur were describing some of the features of that colonization. So under law, occupation, when not authorized, and we can get into technicalities if you like it is in Kashmir, it is not authorized in Kashmir, it is illegal and is considered to be a grave illegality under international law. Colonization is way worse. If you will, it is impossibly illegal under international law. If you think about the international order that we live under, at its foundation is the principle of self-determination. Whatever you remember about the history of World War II and what happened after, the principle of self-determination is at the core of the entire order that we live under. Colonization is a direct assault on that foundation in a nominally post-colonial world. I just want to make sure you can hear me, because I'm getting a note that my connection is a little unstable. Can you hear me okay?
It's wavering a bit, Imran. I'm sorry. So I'm just wondering.
Okay, I'm going to cut my video.
Okay.
Can you
I
still hear
would,
me?
if I can interrupt, maybe if the other speakers can cut their video or put their video off for now, and maybe Imran can keep his on, that may help with the bandwidth, just to try that.
Okay, please just interrupt me if you can't understand what I'm saying. What I was talking about is colonization. It's way worse. It's a direct assault on the foundations of international order. We are nominally in a post-colonial world. And we need to believe that in order for things that depend on that to be real. For example, the things like democracy, the rule of law, and human rights depend on us being in a post-colonial world. But unfortunately, that is not true. We are not in a post-colonial world, and Indian administered Kashmir is a leading example of that reality. So what's happening in Kashmir, the broad territory, I would encourage you to think about Pakistan administered Kashmir like Pakistan, which is to say there are violations, but they are of a certain type. Indian administered Kashmir is a different reality entirely. I'll focus on that region in my comments, Utter did as well. And generally, when I refer to Kashmir in my comments, I'm talking specifically that portion of the territory. As Utter described, for generations, this place has been subject to state repression to sustain colonial domination. That means there have been rampant human rights violations and atrocity crimes, the worst international crimes, widespread, and no accountability for those violations and crimes. And in fact, that's promoted by law and has in fact been promoted by the international community. I'll describe that in part here. In recent years, the Indian government in this region has implemented a policy program, and Robert was describing some of the ideological foundations to that program that was developed by fascist Hindu parties in the early 1950s. And it had certain policy goals. One was to destroy and disintegrate Kashmir. A second was to dominate and disempower Kashmiri Muslims, who are the vast majority of the population, and to Indianize and Hinduize Kashmir and Kashmiris, which means to erase and replace their history, identity, and culture. So that situation has resulted in a circumstance where there is no free expression, no free assembly, no free movement, no free press, no human rights work permitted, no independent journalism permitted in this region. There's a total silencing, pervasive surveillance, very, very limited news, and all of that news is state-controlled. Most of that news is entirely consisting of or comprised of disinformation. Today, there's expanded collective punishment, expanded forced demographic change, total control and domination by an ethno-nationalist state, and the population itself is isolated from the international community, or at least those members of it who would seek to help or speak to the issues that they're facing. That includes international civil society, it includes international media. There's an active program to destroy their economic capacity, educational access, and again, destroy their culture, identity, and history. And I think Utter gave some details about a lot of those phenomena. The recent weeks have meant just more insecurity, death, and destruction. It's a reminder that Kashmiris don't matter. And from the point of view of the international order, they are not humans with rights. In Pakistan-administered Kashmir, what Umar was describing, those consequences are primarily the result of, or a consequence of, geopolitics. India v. Pakistan. They are fighting each other. Bombs drop from the sky, people die, their homes are destroyed, their fields are destroyed. In Indian administered Kashmir, that's true. There's that geopolitical circumstance. But there's also a war being waged by a powerful state and a powerful military against a defenseless civilian population. So in addition to the bombs from the sky, and the last few weeks, you have a further escalation of surveillance, repression, raids, killings, demonization and scapegoating, hate speech promoting violence against this group of people, collective punishment, including blowing up people's houses, mass arbitrary detention. A couple people here said 2,000 people. The numbers that we have is at least 5,000 people have been detained in the last few weeks, and we don't know. The truth is that there's not enough transparency to even know the exact numbers. So on the Indus Waters Treaty, I was asked to speak to, as you might have heard, India suspended the Indus Waters Treaty as in their rhetoric, as a consequence of this recent conflagration. In fact, they've threatened to do so for a very long time, many, many years. The Indus Waters Treaty is a treaty that was signed between India and Pakistan in 1960. It was brokered by the World Bank. What it effectively does is partition the rivers, there are several, 5, of the Indus Valley between India and Pakistan. So to kind of give you a sense, this is one of the most important water resources in the world for many reasons. Just to give you a little description, about 600 million people directly rely on these rivers for their survival. They provide 85 to 90% of Pakistan's fresh water, the entire country of Pakistan. And this was a known issue. Competition over the Indus waters was a recognized issue even before partition. People knew that this was one of the key issues of the broader, if you will, Kashmir issue that has been debated on the international stage since that time. The reality today is one of extreme water scarcity in this entire region, India and Pakistan generally. And the increase in unsustainable demands on that water, coupled with the actual water resource itself dwindling, perhaps dying. So at a baseline, just this element, if you just look at water, it is an existential and explosive situation. What I would also have you understand is that the Indus Waters Treaty itself is actually illegal and invalid according to international law. And I would refer you to a report if you're interested in the details of this that the Kashmir Law and Justice Project put out called Blood Flows with the Water. For our purposes, part of the reason why that's true is because this treaty effectively, as I just described it, is a colonial allocation of other people's resources, Kashmiri's resources. So what the Indus Waters Treaty does and has done, it has facilitated and promoted the denial of Kashmiri's rights, including their right to self-determination, the right to work, the right to adequate standard of living, right to housing, right to a clean and healthy environment, access to their own land and resources, et cetera, et cetera. And for you to understand why, it's important to understand where the treaty came from. And I would refer you again to a Kashmir Law and Justice Project report that touches on this called IWASH. You can find it on the website. But this treaty is actually the brainchild of the United States State Department. The US and the UK, when Kashmir was actively debated at first, the United Nations in 1948, 49, 50 were the leaders at the Security Council on the debate. And I would point you to a specific memo where this idea is first articulated. It's from September 24th, 1951. It's a declassified State Department memo that's available. You can find it through that report I referenced as well. The idea is, according to the State Department representative, an economic solution to facilitate India and Pakistan's development, those states' development, of the economic assets of Kashmir in order to avoid armed conflict between them. And you've seen how well we've avoided armed conflict between India and Pakistan. So the US and UK were actually promoting their own foreign policy goals. It's understandable, every state does it. But the manner in which they did it was to partition the waters of the Indus Basin between India and Pakistan, again, to promote their economic development and to attempt to diffuse a political situation that has never been diffused by categorically and specifically erasing Kashmir and Kashmiris and promoting the violation of Kashmiri's rights. So I'll stop with that and turn it back to Dolores.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Imran. Very, very quick follow-up question, because you have touched on a lot of the legal aspects and how fraught they are. How durable is the current peace between India and Pakistan?
So it's not durable, and it's not even peace. And so in law, occupation is by definition a state of war. Legally, that's true, and practically, it's also true. And as I described here, colonization is also an ongoing phenomenon. Robert Arthur described, settler colonialism specifically, but colonization generally, both legally and practically, is something that is much worse than just war. Omar referred to this, but India and Pakistan are in a state of constant conflict. Sometimes it's hotter, like it was in the last couple of weeks, but there is always conflict. And beneath that conflict, and what the states put out around it, there are people who are living, and Omar did a great job in describing what this means. They live a reality of intense insecurity, constant indignity, and they face untold death and destruction nobody really talks about or reports. The thing is that Kashmir, and there's a question also about, what does it mean for President Trump and the international community, et cetera, and we can kind of explore this further in the questions, but we should remember that Kashmir has actually been a focus of the international community since 1947. So the day before these reported killings in Baisar in Pahalgam, April 22nd, was the 77th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 47 of 1948, April 21, 1948. This is adopted 8 months prior to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to give you the sense of the vintage of the stuff and what it's meant for just establishing the international order that we've had. One paragraph from that resolution, I'll read it to you. The government of India should themselves, and through the government of the state, Jammu and Kashmir, declare and make known that all subjects of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, regardless of creed, caste, or party, will be safe and free in expressing their views and voting on the question of the accession of the state, or referendum, to join wherever they want or do whatever they want. And there will be freedom of the press, speech, and assembly, and freedom of travel in the state, including freedom of lawful entry and exit. None of those things, not a single one of them, was promoted or respected in this region in the intervening 77 years. And today, none of those rights exist in any form. They are completely denied. So the point that I'm making is that despite being recognized as an issue, the reality of what has happened and is happening in Kashmir is not acknowledged. It's not discussed, but it's not even acknowledged. And so in Kashmir, you have the combination of very grave violations, very grave institutional failure, and the very grave and systematic distortion of reality. So directionally, this is really bad. And that's true both of the circumstance and that distortion. It's getting worse. And I'll go back to the Indus Waters Treaty for a second. If you will, what I described is the US and the UK trying to broker a peaceful resolution between India and Pakistan. And I describe that as violative, invalid, and promoting violations, and it does. But that is the product of the international community, if you will, being engaged, and actually at its most optimistic time in the 1950s. And what they produced was a violative agreement that promoted the marginalization of the people it should have centered and the exacerbation of the issues that it was intended to solve. So it was always doomed as a legal treaty, as a way to partition resources, because it's predicated on refusing to acknowledge reality and consequently exacerbates the realities that it refused to acknowledge. It refused to acknowledge the people of Kashmir and their rights. It furthered the violations against them, and in furthering the violations, including through the promotion of expansive dam building and related infrastructure, it has accelerated the destruction of the region's glaciers and the very fresh water resource that it sought to partition. So even if you put aside, as you probably have seen reported, India's threats and actions, things that they're doing today to cut off water to Pakistan. Again, this is 85 to 90% of Pakistan's fresh water. There is this existing severe water crisis. I described that in part. And that has been facilitated by the Indus Waters Treaty itself. And the point that I want to make is that reality is very precarious in this region. It's precarious everywhere, but it's extreme here. Reality doesn't go away. It's not going to go away. A durable peace depends on acknowledging reality. And that's done through transparency. It's done through accountability. It's done through reparations, fixing things that were done wrong. And then implementing principled measures that promote inclusion rather than marginalization and rights instead of impunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Imran. What we had planned for the next part of the webinar was that our panelists who are here, who might want to ask questions of each other, would have a little bit of time, maybe one or two of you, but I'm also very cognizant of the time, and we're close to like 15 minutes, and then we'd be, reaching a time when some people might need to sign off. So sorry, I didn't have my video on. I will ask maybe if there are a couple of you who want to engage with each other for a couple of minutes, and then we would go to other questions that we have for all of you. Thank you. So Athar, Omer, Robert, Imran, are there things you would like to ask of each other?
I don't have any questions for anyone else.
Okay. We also,
What?
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Oh, no, I just want to say I'm grateful to all of the speakers. They were very clear and provide a lot of information. I don't really have any follow-up questions right now.
Okay.
So I do have a question. So maybe directed to everyone, or maybe just Umar. I do want us to kind of speak about the ecological crisis that sort of is like underlining all of this. And it's presenting danger, the Anthropocenic danger that the region is in. Also, you have the nukes, you have the military, which is the size of Dallas. And then they're getting more and more land under them, and which also means munitions, which also means all kinds of accoutrements that the armies have. Then you also have the local police that are also militarized. And now you have how many more bunkers? Is it like 9,000 or 10,000 more bunkers across the LOC? It is the only line of control or line that is militarized that's visible from the space. So, and then you have 8 million people who are kept away from their natural corridors that could make trade easier, that could make their food easier, that could make their lives easier. Can we talk about that and bring out the daily, the tragedies that visit on people by the borders that are not borders? Because Kashmir does not have any technical border inside it. There's a line of control. So we kind of like want to talk about, and I think the global audiences in this moment are really, I don't want to say like this is the moment that people are watching. Kashmir is not re-internationalized. It's not internationalized. It's always been an international problem with Kashmiris as stakeholders. So I think that's also important. But I wanted, Omar, maybe you could speak to that and sort of give us the idea of the danger that the region presents to the people and to the subcontinent.
In addition to what you've said, there's also repetitive environmental degradation in this space. You have repeated earthquakes, floods. This part of the world has most glacial ice outside the Arctic poles. So, with climate change, you have increased flooding and all sorts of, things that kind of intersect and kind of enmesh and layer on the political violence and on the kind of bordering practices that are enforced onto people. So it's even kind of hard to kind of disentangle the Anthropocene from the militarization and the everyday, conditions of, enduring and persisting harm and violence that seeps into everything in that space, right? So when you ask people, if you signal out people and ask them about an earthquake or a flood, it will always come back to the limitations of the border, the imposed border, and also the militarization of the border, the ammunition, the firing, um, the unexploded landmines and how they all kind of intersect with the flooding and the earthquakes to become this one massive atmosphere of violence, essentially. Um, so it's, yeah, I mean, it's just it's just so incredible to kind of even try to articulate the violence that people experience, particularly across the line of control and near and around the line of control. And the line of control, as you say, is an imposed line. It has no material bearing to any Kashmiri in historical sense. But it cuts and structures and kind of an ontology onto people that forces them to then reorganize their lives in relation to the border or in relation to the disruptions caused by the border, I would say, right? It's all an imposition, like you're saying. And I don't know if anybody wants to add.
Robert, you were looking like you're poised to say something.
Yes, I appreciate that answer, but I had something else. I was looking at some of the comments in the chat, and there's one question that comes to mind that I think is interesting and pertinent. Well, they all are, but this one kind of struck me. And just to kind of rephrase it, how much does any of the panelists think that the fact that Kashmir is a mostly Muslim country is part of a global strategic marginalization of Muslims more than we know it's an international issue. It's not simply an issue between India and Pakistan that the Kashmiris have been marginalized, but how much is this part of a strategy, at least among the West and certainly among those that support Zionist, to marginalize Muslim voices in the world?
Somebody like to take that on? Athar, please go ahead.
I think in the Indian context in this moment, of course, it's with its connection to the Zionist entity, and how it draws lessons from there, and not just in this moment, but how they historically have been connected to each other, not visibly till some point in time, where they were still kind of like portraying this very anti-colonial sort of entity that India was presenting itself for the longest possible time, and which the world also got carried away with, deliberately, I want to say. So in this moment, what's happening, and I think there's also a question that Robert, you and I answered about the Pandit question, like how do they fit into this? And I think we both answered that, or maybe Imran and I answered that. So Kashmiris in this moment within the land, it's almost presented as if they're not indigenous to land, as if they're outsiders or they are invaders, with scant regard to the fact that they're also indigenous and they have lived. And I know the question of indigeneity, there's lots of problems with it, and so kind of like entrenching that. But the people who have lived there for the longest possible historical time. So it's also presented as a civilizational question, where Kashmiri Pandit identity is made into this civilizational entity, as if and Kashmiris don't exist. And I think the communal politics that is played, in which the two communities sadly have been so weaponized, and the differences that they had that had most to do with power and class, they have been entrenched so deep that now they're presented as if they're civilizational problems rather than problems of power, rather than problems of class, which is so analyzed when we think about the early 1990s and even before, and how the communities existed with each other. So that's what you see in Kashmir in this moment, as Kashmiris. And then you also have the Indian Muslim question. And I think we always want to reiterate that Indian Muslims are fighting for whatever rights and their marginalization within the Indian constitution. And Kashmiri fight has been against Indian constitution that is imposed on them. But overarchingly, yes, they're doubly marked in that sense, because they're Kashmiri and Muslim, and they're presented as deviant, as they're presented as terrorists. So there's like this, and the world community might want to see it as like homogenous Muslim problem, but I think there is also the Muslim Kashmiri entity, which has for the longest possible time rallied against neocolonialism in a very distinct manner. And I think that's what we need to keep in mind.
Yeah,
Thank
if
you.
I can maybe just add, and I think what Arthur's describing is right. And it's interesting. I mean, the Kashmiri, while Kashmiri Muslims are the dominant, population in the region, they were the disenfranchised and exploited, and group that faced persecution in under the British Raj, right? So you had a Hindu supremacist monarchy that was a suzerainty, actually, that was in power on behalf of the Brits. The Muslims were persecuted. So the politics that developed is not Muslim in an Islamist sense, but is Muslim in its identification of the people who are the ones that are the subject of persecution. And that movement is pro-labor, pro-democracy, pro-rights, and anti-colonial domination. And it has been. This is going back into the 19th century. That history is ongoing, but then you have these other histories that are emerging. So you have the emergence in 1947 of India and Pakistan, and you have the emergence later of other phenomena. Robert, you're talking about some things that are happening, and you sort of see this coming together of things. So you have this complexity in the background that others are describing. But I also think it's interesting, and some of these things have not really, I haven't seen them explored, but I think are worth exploring. The British Foreign Office was cognizant in 1947 of these two issues as being key issues in the Muslim world. And part of their management of their relationship and their withdrawal from the world. I mean, it's kind of hard for us to kind of imagine, but the Brits are disproportionately influential. I mean, they had controlled so much of the world. When they're withdrawing, they are thinking about, how do we manage those relationships? And the two key issues they're thinking about for the Muslim world are Kashmir and Palestine. It's kind of, it's fascinating. So in a weird way, when you have like this in the contemporary time, and I would say the last 30 years, you have this really coming together of Hindutva and Zionism in an active way. There is sort of like historical antecedents, but it's kind of also going in a different direction. One other thing I'll say is that there are a couple of issues. Within the domestic policy of India, you have the emergence and ascendance of in the far right, Hindu supremacist groups, etc. Really, in the last 30 years, around the same time that the timeline that Athar was giving about this elevated violations in Kashmir, they came to power on the back of two key issues in India. One was the destruction of the Babri Masjid. If you know that context, it was a key political rallying point. The second was the domination of Kashmiris, sort of like the treacherous, traitorous, terrorist Kashmiri Muslim, what was otherwise describing. It's very powerful, politically very powerful. And as that movement has been, I'm talking about in India, and as that movement has been ascendant, its anti-Muslim prejudice has been weaponized to an extreme degree. It's not limited to an Indian domestic framework. It's actually very interesting. I don't think most people, let alone most Muslims, understand the degree to which anti-Muslim hate is being promoted from India all over the world. And so there's actually some documentation and investigation and reportage on the linkages between the Hindu right in India and far-right groups all over the world, in Europe, in the US, wherever. So all these things are actually related. Kashmir plays this really central role in a weird way, but it's not to say that that's the only thing that's going on in Kashmir.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There are quite a few questions that are in Q&A, so I also want to ask any of you on the panel if there are some questions that you could respond to, or that you think you'd like to respond to. Again, cognizant that we have limited time, but please. Yeah. There are quite a few questions also that are coming out that are talking about how there's been quite a lot of activism around Palestine, but not about Kashmir, but also questions, asking like, how can journalists contribute to it? How can people build solidarity? So a variety of questions there. You could club them together, respond. I also noticed a question early on that was asking about, I think it was there from Dean. And I think some of this might have been answered, Dean, about Kashmiris being impugned in public discourse after the attack. So we were talking about Islamophobia a little while ago. But if anybody would like to speak more specifically, how Kashmiris have responded to the Indian actions after the attacks, the government military type of attacks, and also how the Indian media and public have been responding. So a lot going on there. Please just feel free to jump in and take what you would like to.
So I'd briefly want to, I don't know what exactly I'll be answering, but I do want to say that in the wake of the Pahalgam killings, Kashmiris came out in droves, which was also in some ways presented as if like there was some kind of an endorsement of India, which usually what India does with the events that happen on ground. Kashmiris came out, they protested, they had visuals, and it was also very telling that they are not able to protest for anything for the last 5 years, any kind of human right violation. They're not able to write. So in this moment, as we are speaking, not being in Kashmir, the silence from the ground, as the world community in one way or the other is talking about them, in which there's mostly silencing of Kashmiris, and we are talking mostly about the securitized narrative between the two states, two nation states. So the global community might be, puzzled as to why there is so much silence from the ground. Even the political quote-unquote leaders, who are basically client politicians who receive Indian patronage and are allowed to speak in this moment, there might be this question like, why is there so much silence? So I think the international community should know and pay attention to the fact that most of the people who spoke for the resistance, spoke for Kashmiri, spoke for self-determination. And we have lots of questions as to why Kashmiri should follow the UN resolutions that were imposed on them by the fleeing monarch and the exiting anti-colonists, so to speak. So like, how do we kind of like continue to support 19th, 20th century solutions to a problem that in 21st century, and how do we take into cognizance Kashmiri will But coming back to the question that Kashmiris in this moment, they can't write, they can't speak, they're silenced to an extent. Their journalists cannot speak, the human rights defenders who for the last 20, 25 years have provided and given vocabulary to what's happening inside Kashmir. And there are a number of them. And one of the leading ones is human rights defendants is Khurram Parvez, who is still in jail from 2021. Then you have organizations, and then of course Yasin Malik, who kind of presents the erstwhile armed struggle and later on kind of like came on the political forefront. He is jailed in this moment. And then many others, and I can't name them all for the paucity of time, but leaders of resistance movement, leaders of journalistic front as well. And there is like institutionalization of censorship that has happened. So journalists cannot write. Everything is against the state security of the sovereignty of India. They can't really talk about. So the moment all of this is happening, I think when the ceasefire ended, there was a fight between militants and the Indian armed forces. No one really pays attention to those kinds of killings that happen every day that are against international Geneva Conventions. Not that there is any respect for human rights, international laws, but I'm just like putting it out there that as we are speaking about Kashmir and ceasefire, there is literally no ceasefire to the daily war that Kashmiris face. And the silence that's emanating from the region about all of this. And also the Kashmiris themselves, that's a question to be asked. The silence should speak louder than the words that they have spoken in the last 77 years and the dying that they have done and the kind of writing that has already been done. I don't think they need to write again and again and again. We just have to go back to the archive. Now you will ask me, where is the archive? Most of the Kashmiri archive in this moment has been disappeared from the internet. It has been wiped. Most of the people here, their websites cannot be seen in India. Their social media accounts are not visible. There's a lot of repression that is happening of the people who have written, who are writing. So Kashmiris themselves on ground, I think we owe it to them to read what they have written, what is still available, and to provide the solidarity, because in this moment they can't speak. And I don't think we can put the burden of speaking on them and ask them, because there is too much danger involved. One person speaking from a family means demolition of houses. Entire extended families, which is what we have seen post Pahalgam attack, where people who were alleged to be part of these attacks, their entire extended families almost lost about 10, 12 houses, and they have been made homeless. And that is the dispossession that follows any sort of word that someone utters against India. Whether that be seen through the lens of armed struggle or unarmed struggle that's kind of pushed through pen and other intellectual efforts that people do. So I think as an international part of international community, we owe it to them that we take their silence into cognizance as louder than the words they could have written in this moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Athar. And as you were speaking, somebody also typed in, somebody who has family in Kashmir, talking about the imposed silences that the people in his village have been told by the military commander not to talk about anything they see, go about their daily lives. So they talk in coded languages, ask questions. Is it cloudy outside? How much cloudy it is, etc. So I mean, it's ongoing, and the fact that there's no ceasefire in people's daily lives. There are a couple of questions that we have perhaps that we could ask. We're thinking of wrapping this up in about 15 minutes, if that's good for everyone. One of them was that there's a common Hindutva talking point about Kashmir, that, saving Kashmir, that Kashmir is India's land. And in some of the work we do here in communities and circles, how do we dispel this propaganda?
Can I start on this question? But actually, I'm going to go back, and Doris, you'd asked a question about, I think journalists. I think there's some stuff in the Q&A. I think it's a broader It's a broader thing. I'm an advocate for trying to understand reality and describe reality accurately. It's an immense struggle in a context like this because almost everything that is written or said is some form of disinformation. So if you go back, and Atta was describing, I think, there are resources, people who are serious scholars, Kashmiris themselves, who are doing work, trying to describe this history. Some has been erased, a lot of it still exists. Find it, read it, understand what's actually happened in this place, what is actually happening, what the terms are that people are using. Robert described, this ideological impetus, which is the source of the question that you just described, Dolores. But there is a need to describe things clearly and describe them as accurately as possible, and then do analysis based on what we actually see. It's very hard right now in Indian administered Kashmir because there's almost no news. I said in my comments that basically there is very limited news, and that news is largely disinformation. But if you start understanding the broader context and what has happened and how we got where we got, you'll understand what's being said, at least what's being reported, what is actually being said. We try to put out resources regularly on this, but I think what's important is that people understand the context and apply accurate language. This is the problem you see in Palestine also. I mean, it's not a feature just of Kashmir, but it's more extreme in a lot of ways in Kashmir because so few people have familiarity and a grounding in the context. So that would be, my point of encouragement for those who are interested. Get educated. There's resources on the KScan website. There's resources on the Same with Kashmir website. There's resources on the KLJP website. The first two organizations are co-hosts of this event. The other is an organization that I work with that I mentioned here, and someone has dropped some links in the chat too. So get educated and actually describe. And if you want to help develop a style guide, one of the things we don't have or I've never seen is a style guide for journalists and others. We've talked about doing over the years. If you are someone who has that capability and is interested in doing that, I'm happy to work with you on it. You can reach out to me through the organizer of this webinar.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Imran. Would anybody else like to say something about that question?
I'll keep going then. So there's one of the whole ideological worldview that Robert was describing. There is an idea that they have many ideas, but one of their ideas is one of what they call Akhand Bharat, right? So there's a greater India, if you will. So if India is the homeland of the Hindus, there's a description of what that homeland is. And that homeland includes, actually, today, what's considered to be the territory of Pakistan, of Afghanistan, of Bangladesh, of Myanmar, of India, but of Kashmir. And as I said in some of my comments, Kashmir as a political tool for the whipping of sentiment in India by the far right has been incredibly valuable. So the demonization of the anti-national, the secessionist, the terrorist Kashmiri Muslim, what Athar was describing, is super valuable political fodder domestically in India. And so Kashmir takes this outsized importance. So the claims about that, the integrity, that Kashmir is an integral part of India. It's actually fascinating if you look at it historically. This is something that Indian diplomats were very careful not to talk about or not to express until the mid-1950s. In the mid-1950s, until that time, they publicly were supportive of the idea of a referendum in Kashmir, et cetera. Although it was clear to the US and UK and others by 1949 and 1950, they had no interest in that. They knew that. Everyone knew it at that time. That said, in the mid-1950s, the rhetoric shifts from India, and you have a very famous speech given at the UN Security Council in January of 1957. It's the longest speech ever given at the Security Council, where the Indian representative goes on to makes this whole statement about Kashmir being an integral part of India. And since that time, on the international stage, that has been the position. It's actually a far-right position. It was considered to be a very marginal position in Indian public discourse in the late 40s and early 50s, but that shifted. And now I would consider it to be, it's the orthodoxy. If you say anything different than that in an Indian context, it is heresy. It's like, it's heretical to say that. You cannot say that. So these ideas have a history. They don't have a reality other than the ideological reality. It's a constructed reality. It's not a real thing. And so again, I would just encourage you to go back to these resources. They're available, and I'll refer you back to the KScan website. Same with Kashmir is another, KLJP is another. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Imran. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to again mention to people who are here in the webinar, lots of questions. We don't have time to answer necessarily all of them, but we're taking note of them. And our objective is to prepare a document of frequently asked questions with subheadings, with resources. Many of them have been already shared in chat, etc. And we will circulate that. So if you got to know of this through a mailing list, or if you registered with an email, we'll try to get this important information back to you. So maybe perhaps for the last question that we will bring to our panelists. It's a broad question, it encapsulates perhaps a lot of what you've already said, but briefly, with a few points, if each of you could say, what does self-determination and land back look for Kashmiris? If we could do a round of all of you. Self-determination and land back for Kashmiris, what would it look like? So we could begin maybe in the order that all of you spoke. We'll begin with you, Athar.
So what does land back and self-determination mean for Kashmiris?
What does it look? What would it look like for Kashmiris? And apologies if you've covered it in some way already.
Yeah,
but to
yeah,
round off, yeah.
I feel like I did cover it in some
Yes.
way. I think one is historically to really question and interrogate that do Kashmiris have to follow the same the resolutions that have been imposed upon them, or the sort of like the colonial resolution for the region, which is, when you think about the plebiscite, they have to join either of the two, or there's no clause for independence, so to speak. So, and also, those are things that need to be questioned, like this fleeing monarch and the colonials, the exiting colonials are putting this really messy solutions onto this region, and then people have to kind of follow it 100 years, 70, 75 years down the line. So I think that really needs to be questioned. So what is independence, or what does self-determination and land back look like for Kashmiris? It means what it means, like, it is land back. It is ending the militaristic regime. It means the sort of like ending the settler colonial apparatus that is prevalent on the region. And it means a decolonization. And also, I think, overarchingly, we have to question what decolonization even means. Because when you think about the United Nations, and decolonization means making more countries in a mirror reflection of the Westphalian nation state system. Is that what we want for the region? Is that what we want for the world? And from Palestine to Kashmir, we are kind of like tending to the ills of what is seen as post-colonialism, but what is actually neo-colonialism. So how does that future look like? I think people and indigenous scholars have already talked about that, how that can look like. That is more sort of like anti-anthropocenic and more ecologically sound, decolonized and demilitarized reality for these peoples across that whole swath.
Thank you, Athar. Robert, would you like to say something at this point?
Yes, very briefly. What Dr. Athar said was completely accurate, and I can't really say it any better. The one thing I want to reiterate, though, is that the plebiscite did not, as she said, provide an option for Kashmir to be independent. The Kashmiris need to determine their own way going forward, their own government, without two choices that are both negative for them. So it needs to be India, Pakistan, or something else, but it needs to be the idea of their independence is very, very important. Now, after the abrogation, the Pakistani leadership said that if the plebiscite were held, and if Kashmir voted for Pakistan and then wanted its independence, Pakistan would grant it to them. That's not codified anywhere, and hopefully it would happen, but the plebiscite isn't going to happen anytime soon. It hasn't been allowed for, as other speakers have said, for 70 years. But what independence and land back is going to look like has to be determined by the Kashmiris. No one else can force that on them. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. So now I will ask Omer, would you like to say anything on this point?
Yeah, I think obviously I should not be the one answering that question. I think for me the main idea is I should be vacating the space and creating discourses and the conditions where Kashmiri people can debate that question. So for me, I think the most important thing to do is step aside and let these conversations flourish within my Kashmiri colleagues and the people that I'm in conversation with.
Thank you. And Imran?
Yeah, again, I'll thank everybody for the questions and for the engagement. I'll just stay with self-determination. And I think a couple of things. I think if you start with, and I mentioned here that the order that we are currently living under, or at least we perceive ourselves to be, whatever the state of that order actually is predicated on the principle of self-determination. Is also fundamental. It's a fundamental human right, and it's considered to be fundamental to all rights. In that conception of the world, you have to have full agency to determine your future in all respects. So what does self-determination look like for Kashmiris? At least that. I'll say two other things. One is, and kind of maybe in response to Athar, and we should talk about this too, what are our options? And we're thinking about in practical, if you will, political terms. What are the options? And I think that's important, and I think it's a discussion to be had. But you can only have that discussion if you have demilitarization, free expression, free movement, a free conversation, etc. We have never had that. Let's just say, when I say we, I'm meaning me and my ancestors for generation after generation after generation, have not had that. So to begin, this is not easy. So to begin to have an idea of what that is, you have to open up the space to have a conversation, to begin to understand what the issues are and what you have to deal with, let alone what the solutions are. There's a Kashmiri idea. It's not just ours, but we have our own version of it. We say azadi. That's what we say, self-determination, we say azadi. And while that term has a certain connotation to it and people use it in different ways, as I said, our struggle for freedom and justice has nothing in particular to do with India and Pakistan. It antedates the creation of those states by generations. And the conception of azadi amongst Kashmiris is not limited to political liberation. It's also economic liberation and spiritual liberation. It's total liberation, and it has a whole history to it. So we have something to say that's not within just the confines of what is allowed today or what is considered to be the legal term for self-determination. That goes beyond. And I'll end with this. I think a lot of people are familiar with Palestine from the questions. You hear in conversations today, what are the Palestinians owed? The broad frame of that conversation is that they should take what they can get and let's move on. I would say to you, it's true for the Palestinians, it's true for the Kashmiris, it's true for anybody. If you are a victim, if you have been violated, you are owed more, not less. And the more that you've been violated, the more you are owed. So when people have conversations, they talk about what is the solution to this, or what is the solution to that? There is no reason, there's no principled reason why one should be subject to what this administration or that government or the current institutional dispensation says is possible. There's a bigger conversation to be had, which is why we are willing to accept in so many places in the world, in so many circumstances in our own lives, things that we should not accept, and why we are so limited in our imagination of what's possible.
So I
Thank
just
you.
had a little thing to add. So we kind of like talked about the context because we're so afraid of the current moment being taken and sort of, the narrative hegemony that India always has had in the last 70 years, despite Kashmiris being so vociferously defending their positions in all forms and shapes. Very recently, we heard that the Prime Minister of India talking about sort of the milestones through the kind of confrontation that they had, the milestones for India, so to speak. One is quote unquote terrorism, eradicating terrorism, and the other is also getting the Azad Kashmir back. And I think that's kind of very important for us to understand why we are thinking through the lens of demilitarization and decolonization. And when Imran says that we haven't had that kind of peace, we haven't had that kind of chance to know each other, because Kashmiris are torn asunder. They don't know, they're divided by a river, so to speak, and this hugely militarized line of control. So the future of the region belongs to them. And the way they are narrativized in this moment, Azad Kashmir is Azad Kashmir for a reason, free and independent Kashmir for a reason. It has history, it has fought for its independence. And then you have kind of like the administered situation around within Pakistan, and that also belongs to the United Nations narrative and the way it has imposed itself on the world. So I think that really also we need to kind of talk about, like, how these people have not been able to meet each other for the last 75 years. Several generations have died and passed and are dying without sitting down together and thinking about what the region would look like, what land back would look like. So we need to have that kind of decolonization and demilitarization for them to come together without the hegemonic narratives and sort of, the securitized narrative that is going to be imposed on the region.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you on this on this panel. So I think we will now bring our session to a conclusion. Clearly, I think we need follow-up sessions, very much so.